Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Wednesday video, at least if you're watching this on my channel. Now, today we are talking to another special guest, and we have a slightly different topic, but obviously still very naval related to talk about. So, first of all, let's allow the guest to introduce himself. Please do so.
Hello, Drock. I'm Wild Bill of Vintage Car History. I've been now on YouTube, thanks to you, for about a year. My channel was literally inspired by the illustrious Drachenfeld and his excellent examples of how to show history and something to listen to while you're commuting, as you started yours, or as such. But I always loved vintage cars and decided I would start a channel, and so I did, and that's how I got associated with our illustrious Drachenfeld.
Fair enough, and it is a very interesting channel. So obviously, those of you who like vintage cars or automotive things in general, obviously, please do head over and give it a watch and give it a subscribe. But today we have a subject that covers kind of both of our fields of expertise. So what are we going to be talking about?
Well, this is interesting because in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were a lot of advances that were happening in the automotive world by specific people, technologies, and infrastructure that had a profound effect on naval design and history up until and through to World War II. And so being a fan of your channel, I went, you know what, that would be a fun thing for us to discuss about, how this all came about, what got us from coal and steam to gas and, and steam, and then gas turbines specifically. Who were the innovators? How did that technology progress? So.
Right. So obviously, those of you who have been watching my channel, you'll see I did a special on naval boilers. There's also some relevance, a crossover between other smaller systems, some damage control systems, and some of the early stuff to do with submarines as well. But where are we going to start?
Well, I think we need to start in the 1880s. And when you were speaking of the water tube boiler and how that came about in your special, because miniaturization became an issue, as you had explained when it comes to shipbuilding. And mind you, I'm a car guy. But, having a boiler that's well above the water line for parts of it is a bad thing. And so you need to make it smaller so that it can be better protected. Well, it was the automotive industry that caused this to happen. And the water tube boiler was actually invented by a man by the name of Leon Serpollet. Now, Leon Serpollet was a Frenchman in Paris. He was already into making of steam engines. And there had already been steam carriages around Paris and in France in general up to this point. In fact, in the 1870s, Amédée Belay was quite the carriage builder, but these were carriages with large boilers and large engines. They were fast and they could move, on the road with, and even haul small trains on roads of sorts, but they weren't personal cars. And what Leon Serpollet did was went, if I'm going to make a car that one person can operate, because this is important. A ship, you have crews. If you're a car, you only have one person. And so you don't exactly have the ability to have a driver and an engineer and a stoker and all of these things in a car. And so what Serpollet did was I'm going to miniaturize the boiler system. And instead of having the typical boiler that was more just like putting a kettle on a stove, having the water flow through the fire, the water tube boiler, he could miniaturize the power and run the power at much higher pressure. And although it was coke-fired, it was his design, which he eventually put on the road in 1884, that led to the navies going, well, wait a minute, this is a much smaller boiler. Can we work on this? And Serpollet ended up working with another man by the name of Peugeot. And the Peugeot company in France, of course, was a very large firm. They were involved in a lot, and that moved the boiler technology from the cars of France into the ships of France.
Yeah, and for those of you who perhaps unaware, the huge difference between the fire tube and water tube boilers, as we've just outlined, is that in a fire tube boiler, the whole thing contains water, and then the heat is passed through tubes within that. So you've got a lot of small fire tubes, and they have to heat the this large mass of water, which takes actually a lot longer anyway, and also limits the amount of pressure that you can build up, because the exterior of your boiler is your pressure vessel. Whereas in the water tube boiler, everything is inverted, so the water passes through tubes within the boiler drum, and the boiler drum contains, well, quote unquote, only hot gases. I mean, those gases might be well in excess of 1,000 degrees, but it's actually far easier pressure-wise to contain boiler gas than it is to contain large amounts of high pressure hot water that's about to turn itself into steam. And has the advantage, obviously, of, because you're heating a smaller volume of water at any given time, the water will vaporize faster, because the energy is going, more heat energy is going into a smaller volume of water, and thus you get power a lot quicker and more consistently.
Mm-hmm. That was one of the things that what they had to deal with regarding the water tube, was because of the difference, you had a problem now of scale, which would happen inside the boiler. And when you're dealing with the pressure inside the boiler tubes now, because it's being contained within those pipes, how are you going to get any of the deposits out of it? And to keep it clear, when you're talking about an automobile, this is a very small device. It's, imagine a water heater in your home. We're talking that size and smaller. And so how do you get in there and clean it? Well, you can't. And so what they would do is they would have valves put in, which were called descaling valves. And these were placed strategically on the bottom of the water tube, so that once you still had high pressure, but were done driving your car, you could open these valves, and it would just allow this fast rush of volume of steam that would clear out all of the nonsense and the scale and the calcium that would build up in deposits, and get it out of there and clear it out. Also, you have the problem of condensation, which in an engine that's, basically a steam engine, once water condenses and it turns from steam into water, well, water does not compress. And so you can have something called a water hammer, in which the engine could literally hydraulic and blow itself apart, because there's now water in that engine. And so this is where descaling and depressurizing, actually, again, invented by Serpollet, was used to keep their engines and their boilers clear of water and clear of scale.
Yeah, and as you say, it's a much more important when you've only got one person who owns a vehicle. I mean, but to be honest, I have a feeling some of that technology will probably be very welcome on ships as well, because I mean, they do have, obviously, sump taps and things like that to get condensation out of the boilers in naval ships. But quite often when you see the cleaning of boilers, you'll see they'll have opened up the entire front plate in the engine room, and you'll see all the tubes, and there'll be some poor ensign or something like that with a long rod going one after the other down hundreds and hundreds of these tubes, which, to be honest, isn't even that efficient a process compared to a descaling valve, as you mentioned. I suppose the main difference there is that with a car, even a steam powered car, you're probably going to be, even ambitiously, you're probably going to be shutting it down after a few hours, which means that the buildup of that day is going to be relatively low, and can be flushed. Whereas with a ship, you might be running that boiler constantly for several weeks at a time, by which point I would imagine probably some of the buildup has gotten a bit too deeply embedded to be flushed out by anything other than somebody with a wire brush and a lot of time on their hands.
Well, you also don't have, the luxury of size. You can't get in with a brush easily and climb into a car's boiler. It's just not going to happen. It's too small. And so there has to be some way to keep it clear without getting inside of it. Because unlike a ship, with a car, if the boiler gets so scaled up and so bad, you just toss it out and put in a new one. That's not a luxury that you have with a ship. But the other luxury that you have with a ship that you don't have with a car is a stoker. You don't have, if you have to drive the car and then you have to be shoveling coal in, Well, it's no longer a car. Now it's a commercial vehicle.
Yeah.
Okay, so which was done on a lot of commercial vehicles. There were, up into the 20s, 30s, and even into the 40s, there were a lot of commercial trucks or lorries that were steam powered and in fact coke fired. It was George Doris in the 1880s that was the first to use a petrochemical distillate or use a gasoline to fire a boiler. And this is extremely important because in the 1880s, early 1890s, you had electric cars were coming into existence. You had gasoline powered cars coming into existence. You had steam powered cars. Diesel was not a picture, wasn't even invented until 1898. And electric power, of course, is powered by batteries or by a generator. But now you have steam power and you have gas power. Now, a gasoline powered car at that point in time, you couldn't just go to a gas station and pick and fill up your tank. It didn't work that way because petrochemical distillates up until the 1890s were not used as fuels except experimental purposes. They were rather used as cleaning agents. They were emulsifiers. And you would go to the local drugstore or apothecary or whatnot, and you would buy a tin of gasoline and you would use it to clean something. And so the idea of using liquid fuel for a car was kind of difficult at first because there was no infrastructure to move the fuel other than the apothecary. Mm. And now you have steam powers now coming in. Well, you can just load up your wood or your coal or whatever, and get your fire going. However, when you're talking about cars, and you have one type that's already dependent on liquid fuel, if you can then take a liquid fuel, which is more volatile than coal and easier to move and control so that you can move your fuel with just a valve, now you've got a steam engine that one person can operate. And this was what George Doris developed in the United States. And that moved rapidly throughout the steam world, is to go away from using coal, using wood, etc., and for automobiles going into using the same type of fuels that the cars were using, the gas-powered cars were using.
And I suppose that also helps up with, especially for a personal vehicle, the fact that although obviously the classic movie, oh look, a bit of petrol, it's obviously going to set itself off like a bomb, is somewhat inaccurate. It is, however, somewhat easier to ignite than something like coal or wood. So I suppose at that point you're transitioning from the point of, I'd like to go somewhere. Okay, well, let's fire up the car and get it warmed up, and then maybe 5-10 minutes later it will have enough pressure to go to, okay, it's on. We should have power fairly soon.
Well, this was important for in the development of the gas-powered boilers because you did have more instantaneous control of your fire. Mm. This also allowed you more control of pressure because unlike a ship of the time, let's say 1900, where the boiler may be running at 250 pounds per square inch, you had cars, like you had the White, you had locomobiles, etc., operating at 750 pounds per square inch. And this is where you're getting into superheated steam and the difference between a boiler and a steam generator, which when we'll talk about Colin White,
yeah.
But it was being able to control it quickly and get a gas-powered boiler up to heat faster. Instead of spending, 45 minutes to an hour to finally get this big kettle of water hot, now you're able to get a much smaller amount of water hot. You're able to do it quicker with a flame you can more control. And this led to all of pretty much the steam cars, of the 20th century and how they would operate, because the White steam car with the steam generator. I mean, that was the first official White House car. Mm-hmm. These were steam powered. A lot of the British cars, the Lanes and the Deauville's. But it's interesting though that at this same time when these when gas was being used for steam and for internal combustion engine, that a number of companies that built ships went into building cars.
Hmm.
but did not build steam powered cars. They built gas powered cars. And this is, you go, well, wait a minute, like Thornycroft,
Mhm.
you know, I mean, why would they build a gas powered car instead of a steam powered car? But there was a very good reason why. It's because at the same time that we have now gasoline and fuel oil and diesel fuel, kerosene is being more readily available. Distilling is now getting better. New products are being developed. Bitumen or asphalt was first synthesized in 1907 by Standard Oil in the United States. You had 1909 British Petroleum doing the same thing out in the Middle East. Shell in the Dutch East Indies. At the same time. Now we're getting more of this type of fuel is becoming available. It's starting to getting moved around. They're building now rail cars designed as tankers. They're now making ships that can move this type of fuel, and an infrastructure is being created because both steam and gas are using the same fuel.
Yeah, and that paves the way in a lot of ways for the development and deployment of oil-powered vessels as well, because it's actually a question that someone sent to me by email probably about a week ago at the time of recording, asking, well, there was oil available much earlier than the mid 1910s, as is evident by the fact that there's gasoline powered vehicles rolling around. Why didn't everybody go over to that a lot sooner? Because it's so much cleaner and easier than having to load coal every time you want the boiler and then stoking it for warships. And I had pointed out that as you just said, it's the infrastructure more than anything else. I mean, there's also the supply issues. Back in the late 19th, early 20th century, the US is probably the only country that's producing oil on a scale that you could afford to dump thousands upon thousands of gallons into a ship. But even as things like the Middle Eastern oil fields start to come online, which the British Empire controls, it's, do you have the infrastructure to move all of that from your point of sort of extraction to your point of refinement to your point of use? And that for coal has been being built up for almost a century at that point, but for oil and gasoline and all the other fractions thereof, it's just not there. When oil starts to become a thing, you can, as you said, you can get it in small quantities moving around with other goods, but it's not until that sort of late 1900s, early 1910s that the real infrastructure is built up that allows for the mass transportation of this and makes it commercially worthwhile. Because that's the other thing, you could theoretically build up the infrastructures to do this, but it's going to cost an awful lot of money to build and maintain. And if no one's using the end product, then those companies aren't going to make money, so they're not going to do it in the first place.
Right, and it was also driven nation to nation in how each country really took to the automobile or didn't. Because in some countries, for example, the United States, the infrastructure actually built fairly quickly once you get past World War I. Whereas you have other nations, France, for example, by 1910 already had a fairly well developed infrastructure for moving fuel oil and gasoline. And a lot of the attitude towards the people towards automobiles and towards cars has been skewed, quite frankly, by some historians, quote unquote, and saying that cars were just the toys of the rich in Europe. Well, that's not true. In exclusivity, you had, yes, those cars that were the toys of the rich, but you also had the taxis, you had the cycle cars, for every Graf and Steve, you have a Humber. There were the cars of the people too. I mean, you can't look at an Austin 7 and say that was not an important car, in popularizing automobiles in Europe. And it was Europe that drove the automotive industry in the late 19th and early 20th century. It wasn't the United States. We did do a lot of advances in steam power at that time. But as far as the gasoline powered car, I mean, the technology was booming in Europe and the infrastructure was building in Europe. to actually move oil. And one of the first things that was done was to make tanker cars for railroads. If you're moving coal, if you can move, you should be able to move gas with it too. That was the idea. The problem is that wherever the coal was being made is not where the gas was. So just because you could make a railroad that will move coal doesn't mean that you have a railroad where the gasoline is. And so now you have to build new rail lines. And it was easier for many countries to simply use existing roads, and which is what, prior to World War I, particularly in France, is where you have the development of the tanker truck and of the vehicles specifically designed to take gasoline over roads. And that was the first logistic moving of fuel. Problem is that that's not enough to move, to fuel a ship. You're not gonna, gas up a battleship with freightliners,
No.
trucks. It's not going to happen. And this is where, again, right prior to World War I, primarily in France, you see the development of pipelines. And instead of using roads or trying to use railroads, why not just have a pipe? Since it's a liquid, and just have it go from, where we're pumping it up to the distillery, and then pipeline it to areas where you already have an existing road or rail infrastructure. And this is what started to develop right before World War I, primarily in France and Germany, which led to eventually that fuel getting to the ports. And after World War I, gasoline, fuel oil being available on a much larger scale for naval use.
Yeah, and I think there's two things to pick up, one naval and one road, at least from the UK perspective, I suppose. Within that, one of which, as you say, is the fact that road vehicles and self-propelling vehicles in general, certainly in the UK, I'm obviously, I don't know as much about US history, but one of the most common road vehicles, the self-propelling vehicles on land that you'd see in the UK in the late 19th century was the traction engine. And that is very definitely not a rich man's toy. most rich people would say that's the tool for the peasants who make all the food and the everything that I eat. But they're incredibly widespread. There's an awful lot of pictures, even if maybe 1880s, 1890s London is still mostly horse and carriage, but 1880s, 1890s Surrey, Sussex, Kent, etc. There's traction engines and other similar vehicles rolling around all over the place, quite happily operated by what people might otherwise dismiss as the working classes, because they're incredibly useful and incredibly powerful things. It still amuses me greatly. It was about 3 or 4 years ago, I was at an event, a reenactment event, was a multi-period history event, and they had a competition where they had a modern tractor versus an old traction engine. And this tractor was huge. It was about twice the size of the stuff you'd normally see in a field, at least in the UK. So it had a lot of power behind it, and it started off, and the traction engine just kind of stood there and went, that's nice. Opened the valve and trundled off at about 4 miles an hour in the other direction, with absolutely no heed to the fact that this sort of 1,000+ horsepower tractor was desperately flailing in the background, trying to do something.
Yes, and it's interesting when you say that, this is what you saw in England. There's another reason for that, and that was called the Red Flag Act of 1865. You see, in Europe, where you didn't have this law, you had steam carriages. You had, it wasn't just traction engines. There were other things that were on the road that were steam powered, but you didn't have that in Britain because Queen Victoria hated these smelly, disgusting, nasty things on her roads. And so enforced this law that was within Great Britain, on the highways of Great Britain, the maximum speed limit was 4 miles an hour for a machine vehicle. If you were within a city limit, it was 2 miles an hour, and you had to have someone on the vehicle blowing a horn and ringing a bell, as well as someone in front of it walking with a red flag, waving it about 50 or so yards ahead of it for every single vehicle that was on the road. So anything that was a fast vehicle, there was no point in Europe. There's no point in Britain.
Yeah.
Okay, because you couldn't drive it fast anyway. And so traction engines are naturally slow. their maximum speed, they're not going to break the speed limit. So
No.
let's just use those, and you're all over.
Yeah. They just never, they just don't stop for anything.
Right. But you can't stop them. That's they're vicious.
Mm.
But I did want to go back to one other thing regarding steam generating, because
Mhm.
we did talk about the flash tube boiler, the water tube boiler, but
Mhm.
now we need to talk about the steam generator, because this is where you're going to have those very, very compacted type of boilers, that very, very thin tube, very small tube, and this was specifically invented by Colin White
Mhm.
in the late 1890s, and started coming into ships, I believe, around World War One. But this is the steam generator, and what made this particular type of fire flash boiler extremely powerful was that rather than getting several gallons of water, hot, there was literally just cups of water. And since it was using a very high amount of tubes, very small, a lot of surface area, the steam wasn't just turning into steam, it was becoming superheated steam. This is steam, 1,000+ degrees, where the volatile energy that's within it is just phenomenal. And so this is where you have these boilers that are now running at 700, 750 pounds, that you could actually get up to that amount of heat and amount of pressure within a matter of less than 15 minutes, as opposed to an hour or so. And that technology revolutionized boilers on ships.
Yeah, and obviously it was adapted at different rates in different navies. So quite famously in naval circles, by the time you get to World War II, the US Navy has, to a large degree, perfected high pressure boiler technology, and is enjoying a lot of the benefits of that. The Germans also have high pressure boilers, albeit that they haven't managed to quite get them down to the level of, I say simplicity, but I mean, that is a bit of a misnomer, because even a US Navy high pressure boiler setup in something like a Fletcher class destroyer is still a fairly complicated bit of machinery and not something to be messed with. But you could at least, you could teach someone how to use that with an operating manual, as opposed to some of the German systems where you need more of an operational library to understand just exactly how these things work. And oh yes, well, we've got the boiler up to pressure, right? Consult volume 7 on on the maintenance requirements, which you see at the end of World War II when Prince Eugen comes over into the custody of the US Navy, and there's a small bit of logical failure there, because they look at the pressures and they go, okay, what's it broadly similar to the US systems? I guess that we should be able to keep it going. They send the most of the engineering crew of Prince Eugen back home, and within about a week, 7 out of the 8 boilers, I think, have just completely seized up, because it's more of a kind of a, if you ever see the interior of a Hipper class cruiser's engineering section, it looks more like a cross between a Star Trek engineering emergency and a steampunk nightmare thrown together. There's so many valves and gears and gauges, and everything has to be operated simultaneously.
And it's funny with for example, the White steam car, 1907 White 30 horsepower. I've seen the actual owner's manual for this vehicle. Now, this is a high pressure steam generating car, and it says in the owner's manual, it literally says, do not try to modify anything. Do everything exactly the way we say. If you try to make any changes to this, it will no longer work. It literally says this in the manual. Because, and they were right, because that high pressure steam system and steam generator, full condensing, etc., it's a self-enclosed system. You can't make it better than the way they made it in 1907. You can't improve it, and yet this is 1907 that this is being done. Okay, that wouldn't even find its way onto US Navy ships for another 20 years.
And I think the other thing to point out is, as you mentioned, was the fact that this new system used smaller tubes compared to the older ones. So you had fire tube go to water tube, but now the water tubes themselves are getting smaller and more numerous, which at a very basic level, it increases the efficiency of things because you have a much greater surface area to volume ratio. So there's a lot more heat being put into the water that you're trying to heat up, which is why you get the more rapid build of pressure, and also just greater throughput of energy. And that's very important because those of you who've been regular viewers of the channel will know that one of the things I semi-occasionally mentioned is the fact that Admiral Jellicoe wanted to put small tube boilers in the Queen Elizabeth class battleships, and he reckoned that that would push them up to 28 knots, which would, hilarious enough, have made the Queen Elizabeth's fast battleships about 20 years before the concept actually came about in real life history. But he was dissuaded from advancing this at the time relatively new technology, bearing in mind the Queen Elizabeths are being designed in 1911, 1912, which is not that long after the concepts being explored in a smaller scale in the automotive industry. And the big shipyards, they're not too trusting of this, and they persuade him to go with the larger tube boilers, and you get the historical Queen Elizabeth designed for 25 knots, maybe 24 and a half on a good day in actual fact, because they complete a bit overweight. But whilst 3.5, 4 knots increased speed might not sound like a tremendous amount, bearing in mind that you're going through water, it actually does reflect a phenomenal increase in power output, because as they come into service, the Queen Elizabeths are carrying about 75,000 shaft horsepower coming out of their various boilers. But to get up to 28 knots, you need about 120 plus thousand horsepower. So you're talking about 60% more power in the same volume of boilers. So it's a phenomenal increase in actual power output. I mean, imagine if the average car these days, family saloon or whatever that most people might drive, it's probably putting out something in the region of 120 to 200 horsepower, depending on the size of the engine. Now, imagine if say you've got a 200 horsepower engine, and then you come back the next day and you discover that thing's now kicking out 320, 330 horsepower, in the lower range of sports cars, that you're going to have a phenomenal increase in the performance of your vehicle. And it's the same thing, obviously, for steam-powered vehicles and for steam-powered ships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the fun thing that I find with that whole concept is that in 1905, the world record fastest car was a Stanley steamer, steam-powered car with over 121 miles an hour. And that you can put so much power into a steam engine, and a steam engine makes its power from rest. It's unlike a typical gas engine. You got to start it up and get it moving before you can do anything with its power. Not so with a steam engine or an electric motor for that matter. The moment you apply steam, you're moving. And one of the things that's interesting about steam engines is the point of diminishing returns that happens, because you have in ships, you have, expansion engines, double expansion, triple expansion, quadruple expansion, etc. That does not exist in cars. And the reason is simple, is because if you look at a steam engine and you look at the different cylinders, say if you look at a triple expansion engine, the smallest cylinder is the one that is the highest power or the high pressure cylinder, because it doesn't need to be as big, because the steam has much more volatile energy into it to transfer. And then when you take that same steam and move it to the next cylinder, that cylinder is of course larger because the steam has less energy, and so it takes more surface area to capture that energy. Well, in a steam car, you will never find a triple expansion engine. Rather, the most you will find is a double expansion engine, which in car speak is called a compound engine. And the reason is simple, because once you have used your steam the first time, you can use it one more time and you're still going to get a lot out of it. But in a car where you only have, maybe 15, 16 feet to work with, to add that third cylinder with the size that it would have to be, with the mass that would include, it's not worth the weight of the car for what little return you would get for power. So you're not going to see anything more than a 2-cylinder engine, or possibly a 4-cylinder engine that's a steam, but it would still be like a too high pressure, too low pressure.
Mhm.
And that's called compounding an engine in steam cars. You're not going to find that any bigger than that
No.
for a ship.
No, no. 'Cause I mean, yeah, as you say, you have a much harder limit on dimensions when it comes to a road vehicle than you do with a ship, where, yeah, the sea is rather large, and to be honest, it's also just the square cube law, isn't it? It's the engine
Right.
volume that you have in a 15-foot by 8-foot vehicle, as compared to a 150-foot by 80-foot ship. The proportional volume is going to be much, much larger.
Right. But this is why the boiler technology in the cars moved so rapidly, is because you couldn't make the engine bigger to get more power. So therefore, your boiler was your only source. Therefore, if we're going to make cars and be able to get to those kinds of speeds, we have to make boilers that are far more efficient and far more compact to save the weight and be able to produce the high pressures that are necessary to get a smaller engine moving with a lot of power.
Yeah, and I mean, it shows actually across the board with, when you get into the realm of ships or vessels, I guess, because they're not technically ships, that actually do have compact space issues where you can't expand them too large, which I'm thinking particularly of submarines. An awful lot of submarine engine technology, obviously they're battery powered underwater, but World War I, World War II, they still require a separate power source to charge those batteries, and when they're running on the surface, a huge amount of that technology they attempt to bring in directly from ships, destroyer power plants and such. And aside from the occasional slightly misguided efforts with things like the K class, where they literally pile in ship-based high pressure steam engines to try and get them to keep up with the fleet, doesn't end too well. But obviously, as we know, most of these ships are powered by diesel engines, but also prior to that, somewhat less successfully because of fumes and explosions. But in the early part of the 1900s, also gasoline-powered engines. All of this is broadly adopted in from the automobile industry because, as you just said, within the automobile industry, space and weight are an absolute premium. So you have to get the most reliable, highest power density power plant you possibly can, whereas you can afford to be a little bit more relaxed when it comes to shipping. But then when it comes to a sub where you don't have a lot of space, well, it's fair. In hindsight, I suppose it seems fairly obvious which of the two industries you should be taking your power plant from, even if for various reasons at points navies kept trying to adopt naval power plants directly into subs, usually with horribly catastrophic results.
Yeah, and one of the other things that many of the automotive manufacturers did was provided small engines for navies for portable pumping systems. And for portable generators, etc. I mean, as early as Daimler in 1886 was doing this. And when you look at all the miniaturization that was done in these power plants, as you were just discussing, there were a lot of different applications for that type of engine and type of motors in ships. I mean, I've served 8 years in the U.S. Navy myself. And I've seen plenty of times where you just need a small motor to run a small generator to get a light here or a small pump here or something. And that was in the 19th century. That was technology created for the automotive industry, then being applied to the navies of the world.
Yeah, and it's a lot of people owe their lives to that particular bit of innovation because, especially in World War II, I know, once again, there is a video about this, but when you look at the damage control procedures, the most easy contrast is the US Navy and the Japanese Navy, which is what the video is mostly about. But apart from the training and social construct issues and all other things that did affect the difference in damage control, part of it was also the equipment. The US Navy had a huge number of portable gasoline-powered pumps. And when I say portable, we're not talking about literally, I'll pick it up in your hands and run off with it. They're still pretty hefty things because they've got to pump a fair bit of water. But they're the kind of thing, almost, weirdly enough, almost Ark of the Covenant style, stick a couple of poles in the side and two men can run off with them.
P250.
Yeah, there's a few smaller ones as well, but there's so many of them and they work so well at a very compact scale that even if the rest of the ship has lost power, or perhaps the section of the ship you're in has lost power, which is a bit more understandable. Someone's been inconsiderate enough to blow a gigantic hole in the side. These things are small enough and powerful enough to either eject large volumes of water back out the ship if there's water where you don't want it to be, or if the ship's on fire, to bring large amounts of water into the ship so that you can fight the fire effectively. And without those kinds of things, a lot more ships would be lost. I mean, recently, obviously, I did a 5-minute guide on USS Franklin, but you look at both Franklin and Bunker Hill, you look at the infernos that those ships turned into, compare and contrast that to the infernos that Akagi and Kaga became at the Battle of Midway. And in terms of how they start out, there's probably an argument to be made, at least, that Franklin and Bunker Hill's initial fires are probably actually larger and more deadly, at least, than Akagi's. Probably Kaga's is a bit worse off to start with, but they're all roughly within the same ballpark. But of course, Akagi and Kaga burn out and are sunk, especially Kaga. But Franklin and Bunker Hill managed to make it back to the US. And a lot of that is in large part because of these small portable pumps that allow large numbers of crew to fight the fires quickly. And of course, as you know, I'm sure your training covered, the one thing you don't want is to allow the fire to spread, because it becomes exponentially harder to fight the fire the further it goes.
Yes, being that every sailor is taught damage control, at least in the U.S. Navy. I spent, as I said, 8 years. I was a fire control technician. That's why, of course, I'm into your channel. I mean, obviously, you talk about fire control all the time, so I'm into that sort of thing. And, just in getting into cars, I mean, I've just loved it since I was a little kid. And of course, being in the Navy and then seeing your channel, I went, you know what? I got to start a channel, and that's why we're here.
Yeah. And as I say,
you're inspiring, sir.
Yeah, well, a lot of people when I was in high school probably say I'm inspiring in the sense that I inspired them to try and hit me. So it's a nice change of pace that I'm inspiring people to do things because of me and not to me.
Well, that's why I love your channel, what you do, and again, I thank you for just being supportive of my channel and helping me get going and giving me some good advice. And I can assure you, I've got some very interesting stuff coming in the future on vintage car history.
Well, that
together in the future some more.
Yeah, definitely. We will definitely be working some more, and obviously people obviously encourage you to go and have a look. And I mean, this is the thing. I've spoken to one or two other people, including you as well as yourself, who have started channels either in part or because of what I've done. And the thing is, this is basically the ultimate. This is what I view as the ultimate success of the channel, because the whole point is to get knowledge out there so other people can learn from it and experience it, and B, so that it's preserved, because there's huge swathes of history in naval terms, and as I'm sure you've experienced in automobile terms, that a lot of people don't know, probably either isn't recorded in modern commercially available books, or if it's recorded at all, it's recorded in scattered places all over the place. So it takes a dedicated researcher to find and put them all together into something that resembles a coherent narrative. And as time goes on, we're at risk of losing that, or it becomes harder and harder to find. But someone who is prepared to put the work in and does have that knowledge and is able to then present that information to the outside world, that means that overall sum of knowledge is preserved, which is always a good thing. And the more that happens, the better, regardless of what subject it's in. So I'm really gratified when people like yourself start up a channel, because apart from anything, if I wanted to know about the history of cars, which, to be fair, I do, because it's, as an engineer, it appeals to me on a very instinctive level, but there's not enough hours in the day for me to do my naval history research and live the rest of my life and also develop a widespread knowledge of automobile history, with the amount of research that would require. But the fact that your channel now exists means that I can gain at least some of that knowledge without having to invent a time turner and relive the same day 6 times over every day. So I'm really pleased when this kind of thing happens.
Yeah, and it's been a lot of fun because as creating these channels, writing the videos, etc. And actually there wasn't anybody out there doing what I'm doing,
Mm.
about the early automotive history. If it's I couldn't find the channel. So it was like, if it is to be, it's up to me sort of situation. Like if you're riding on a train and you want to listen
Mm.
to naval history and no one's doing it, well, then it's up to you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I suppose it's one of the advantages, of the modern day, rather than 20, 30 years ago. It would have been a case of, people wanted to do this, it would have been either try and persuade somebody like National Geographic or PBS or the BBC to somehow sign us on to present, maybe a 1 hour program that goes out in the middle, goes out at like 10 o'clock at night and is never shown again, or start writing books. And yeah, trying to get into the book publishing world is a whole other, that probably requires a whole other profession to understand that. Whereas nowadays, we can spread our knowledge like we are now, and then it stands or falls on its own merits.
I'll tell you what, Drock, this has been a lot of fun,
Yeah.
and appreciate the time we've spent together. And hopefully we'll be able to spend some more time. And once I get more into World War I, we can start talking about some more interesting stuff.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, but when you get the start of the land battleships, although I guess I suppose since it starts off with armored cars, that probably should be the land destroyer. But we shall see in a future episode. So thank you very much for coming on the channel, and obviously, as we said now a few times, do check out links in the description below, and we'll see you all again in another video. Bye bye.
Peace.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.